Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Good evening. Matthew, I just have to say one thing. We live in the craziest country in the world, okay? I just read a report about these nitwits in Kansas who are trying to ban CBD. They're trying to make it illegal. Have you read this report?
All right, yeah. So I read the article, and that sounds a little inflammatory to me. I don't think they're trying to ban CBD. I think, from what I understood, a question went up to the state attorney general, who said that as far as he interpreted the laws on the books, it's already illegal.
Right. So how stupid is this guy?
Well, I mean, he's the attorney general. I guess he gets to decide how laws are interpreted and reported and enforced in the state of Kansas. But I mean, yes, I personally agree with you that this is stupid.
So I read this report, and I have to say I needed to talk to somebody in Kansas to get a little grounding on what the hell goes on in that crazy state, okay? It's just an unbelievable state in the United States of America.
Being from there, I can vouch that it's very crazy at times.
It is a whack place, man. So we found this guy who runs, believe it or not, a CBD store in a very wealthy suburb called Overland Park, a wealthy suburb
Johnson County,
right? And I called him up and I said, will you talk to us on the air about what it's like to live in a state where they're going to ban the main product that you supply to patients to keep them alive, to keep them happy, to keep them not having seizures? And we got Brian right on the phone to talk about this. Brian, just tell me your name, spell it correctly, and tell me the name of your store again for the record.
It's Brian Pitts, BrianPitts, and our store is Phoenix Natural Wellness.
So Brian, thanks for joining us tonight. You run a store outside of Kansas City called Phoenix Natural Wellness that sells exclusively CBD products, correct?
That's correct. We sell 90% of our inventory is CBD. We do carry some like products, lotions, and some supplements, but the bulk of it is the American Shaman CBD product.
So something strange happened in Kansas the other day. Another strange thing is that lawmakers in what is called the Sunflower State, Kansas, have asked the state to declare CBD illegal. Now, why would they do that, do you think?
I'm not sure that's entirely correct. Really what happened was the district attorney from Johnson County, the county that my business resides in, partnered with the Shawnee County, which is in Topeka, Kansas, district attorney, and they asked for the interpretation of the attorney general's, feelings on CBD and the legality of it.
Yeah.
And he replied with kind of a blanket statement saying it's not legal. He didn't really take into account any of the farm bill, and we also have a House bill. I believe it's 268. I can't remember the number of the farm bill currently.
The farm bill that made hemp legal to grow and propagate in Kansas, correct?
Correct. Okay. So this was a statement of his opinion, not really his interpretation of the law. There was a lot of rumor and conjecture that they were bringing a bill to the House to say, let's make this illegal. That's not entirely true. What actually happened yesterday was Willie Dove introduced a new bill to specifically put language in to legalize hemp for Kansas farmers to grow so we can compete in the world market of hemp. That's good, but it's not great for the CBD people. There's not a clear-cut language in this bill that says CBD will be legal, and that's really what we need.
How many customers, patients, subscribers do you serve currently?
I would say in the thousands.
In the thousands.
Since we've had some more news stories and some more coverage from news stations locally, and we've seen a great rise in our business just this past week.
Oh, great! Congratulations. now that it's threatened, right? So, what kind of folks are using CBD in Kansas where you are, and how are they learning about it?
All age ranges, really, from young people in their 20s. But I would say the average age of our clientele is probably between 40 and 60.
They're using it for what? Pain?
Yeah, the majority of it are inflammatory diseases. But I've got younger people that come in for Crohn's treatment, Lyme's disease, IBS, anxiety is a big one.
Yeah.
You see a lot of the younger folks with the anxiety issues, and then the older folks with the inflammatory diseases, such as arthritis and that sort of thing.
How was your anxiety level when you heard about this bill and this opinion?
I took quite a bit of CBD the past couple days.
I'll bet you did. How's it working?
Pretty well. I took 25 milligrams before I got on with you guys. I'm a little drowsy.
Now, tell me something. No, seriously. What's your response to this as a business owner, as a CBD entrepreneur?
Well, we heard this kind of through the grapevine over the past weekend, and then it came to light the following Monday. That day, we pulled product from our shelves. We kept our doors open just to educate and talk to clientele and have them sign letters to mail to congressmen and senators. And then I did really some hard thinking over the next night. And I said, I can't keep this out of the product out of the public's hands. It's too important. It's too beneficial. So I loaded my case back up and I started selling stuff again. Really with the thought that if they're going to make it illegal, they're going to have to come in here and tell me that, or they're going to have to come take it. At this point, it's really Mr. Howe, the prosecutor of Johnson County. It's kind of a stalemate. He's the one forcing this issue. And if he really wants to push it and he wants to make a seizure or an arrest, we will immediately turn around and file an injunction, which just opens us right back up.
Well, quick question for you. Hasn't there already been an injunction filed or a motion filed on behalf of Jason Todek and Shaman CBD?
It's my understanding they have not filed the motion because there was no action taken legally. There was no seizures. There were no arrests made. So an injunction would basically be dismissed at that point.
Brian, you come at this from a certain personal angle too. You have a daughter who has who uses CBD for what illness? Is it autism?
Yeah, my daughter Cecilia, who's 17 now, is autistic. You would say she's probably high functioning autistic. We saw a lot of anxiety develop in her through her teen years, through puberty, as she started to develop as a young lady. High school seemed to just kind of wreck her completely.
I said it ruined me too, high school.
Yeah, a lot of us. So, we got her on a good probiotic and we started her on some CBD. And after about 30 to 60 days, we started to really see an improvement in her. Her anxiety level dropped dramatically. She had been experiencing catatonia, where we would catch her frozen in one place. And that seemed to really subside. But more importantly, she started to interact more with the family. We started to get more eye contact from her. She became more verbal and talking about things that are bothering her specifically. And it just kind of seemed to really free her, which was wonderful to see.
Wow. So
she was really an inspiration to start the business. At the same time, my stepson Logan this past summer was diagnosed as epileptic.
Oh, man.
And that was a real tough summer. And he also takes the CBD product with great success, and he's over 140 days seizure-free now.
Oh, congratulations. I'm so glad to hear that. So last question, which is a leading question, but what's it like to live in the same country where states not that far from you, like Colorado, are legal, and all this stuff is not even possibly going to affect the Coloradians or Coloradoans? And there you are in Kansas, where you're having treatment by geography and the law is threatening your very existence. Tell me your feelings about that.
Well, it's like I said on the newscast, these are antiquated prohibition laws. The feds leaving it up to the states is kind of a mess. I can appreciate the feds not wanting to put their thumb into it, but there needs to be some clear-cut laws made. My opinion on the entire matter really is people will keep buying the product. They will get it wherever they can get it because it works. And whether they're buying it from me and I'm paying my income tax and my property tax and my business tax, or they'll get it from Colorado or they'll go to Missouri. So our legislators need to just get on board.
Brian, Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and thanks for being on the ground and fighting the fight right at the barricades there. I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, I do as well. And we don't want to get you in trouble by, flooding your front doors. But as you said, Phoenix Natural Wellness is open for business. You're still vending product, right? So people can come to you and, all right, well, keep on going, man.
Hope our listeners in Kansas flood your gates.
Thank you very much.
Brian Pitts, he's sort of an amazing guy, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's really good that they're keeping the doors open. They're taking signatures. They're keeping a list of names. They're taking the fight to the people. There's a couple other people involved. Jason Todak, who was mentioned in the interview. They have, in fact, Sean Pickett is his attorney, and they have, in fact, filed an injunction to make sure to sort of force this issue. And it's a weird kind of waiting game, I think, that they're playing. They need somebody to make the first move.
This is like the last throes of prohibition to me. They are looking at every single nuance, every crack, every it's like they're scratching and sort of infecting every open sore just to sort of drive people crazy.
Yeah. I don't get it. Especially from like conservatives, Republicans especially are the ones that just boggle my mind, because if you're all about the free market and you're all about economic growth and you're all about personal liberty and personal freedom, how can you be anti-legalization?
Because, Matthew, it's a drug.
I guess.
But by the way, our next guest uses drugs in a very interesting way to explore spiritual life, to explore creativity, to explore sensuality, to try to understand how drugs, plant drugs in specific, have been with humanity ever since the beginning of time. One of the interesting things when I was reporting Brave New Weed that I learned was when I started thinking about it, like, okay, why in the Western Hemisphere were plant medicines banned? And you know what the answer was? Christianity.
You think?
I know so. When the Catholics came to conquer the New World, they came across a whole bunch of Indians who were using plants.
Well, and it was anything that felt good or made you happy was sort of questioned immediately, right?
That was true for those no-fun Catholics at the time. Yes, but also they wanted man's focus off of the earth into the heavens. This whole idea of one God in heaven was a profound idea. And people who played with plants and used plants to extend their consciousness were a huge threat to that.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, I think something that could connect anyone with their choice of God would probably be a little bit of cannabis.
Cannabis is a good one. So let's talk to Stephen Gray about the connections of cannabis and spirituality, which happens to be the title of his book. His book is called, again, Cannabis and Spirituality, An Explorer's Guide to an Ancient Plant Spirit Ally. So you're Stephen Gray, and your book is called Cannabis and Spirituality. And Stephen, you live where?
Vancouver, British Columbia.
So when you say your medicine-related work, what kind of medicine do you practice?
I'm kind of connected to a lot of the entheogenic medicines. I co-organize a conference here in Vancouver called the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. So I'm connected to a number of different people and groups and such like, and I've used a number of them over the years. I was fairly involved for about a dozen years with the Native American Church and their peyote prayer ceremonies. I've used ayahuasca a bunch. More recently, I'm kind of like a guest member of a local Santo Daime group here in Vancouver. So 3 or 4 times a year, I'll go to their works, as they call them.
And their plant is, which plant is theirs?
They work with ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca. So in all the plants you've toyed with, played with, experimented with, whatever word you choose, How does cannabis fit into the scope of some of the plants you've
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. There's lots of different ways to think about it or talk about it. You might consider it sort of the little brother or little sister of some of the so-called major entheogens. But as you know yourself, and as many people have found out, sometimes to their detriment, cannabis can also be extremely powerful, especially when taken in edible form, oral ingestion. It can be extremely powerful. I mean, as Terence McKenna once said that, in the proper circumstances with the right intention and ritual container and so on, cannabis has almost the full spectrum of psychedelic effects.
Yeah, a lot of people think that. That's never been my experience. Has it been yours?
Well, as I mentioned, I've been reading your book, and I kind of get this endless, and I watched that YouTube video, and kind of get the sense that we're sort of in the same ballpark that way. I like to get what I consider to be quite high, but certainly not out of control. One of the concepts or principles that I've floated through the book and elsewhere is that one way of thinking about optimal dosage is the dosage you both want to and can handle. And when I say can handle, I don't mean just sort of like clinging to the side of the rowboat until you can finally drag yourself up on a rocky shore. I mean that you can actually stay relaxed, present, open, and not overwhelmed by the effects, right? And I think there's a lot of issues around that because you talk, I talk, and we're discussing a lot these days about dosage. I think it's very possible to ride into extremely powerful spiritual places if you really know how to handle the medicine. It's having been around these other medicines, there's a kind of a similarity, with the peyote. The people that throw up a lot are the beginners, and it's somewhat similar with ayahuasca depending on the circumstances. Certainly in the Santo Daime church, the elders or the people that have been around for a while, they don't throw up much, And in the peyote churches, they also talk about how even the visual quote unquote hallucinations are considered oftentimes to be distractions. What it's really about is the dissolution of the ego, in a sense, and opening up to spirit, or whatever you want to call that, open heart, as Buddhists call it, awakened heart, the peace that passes all understanding, or whatever,
Yeah. I mean, just one on dosing. You have a great quote from Neil Young in your book, in one of the chapters on the basics, which says, look, if you smoke a little, you wrote a great song. If you smoke too much, you were toast.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought that was, very Neil Youngian way of putting it.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah. Well, I noticed that you've written about dosage in regard to creative work as well, and the sort of one of the phrases that is used by several of the contributors in my book is "less is more," right? And less is more can mean both dosage and frequency of use, which is another thing that is important, and we could get to later if you want to.
How about right now?
Oh, okay. Well, it's a really interesting topic. It's getting away from sort of where we were about, the use of cannabis as a creative tool a
I'll come back.
bit.
We'll come back.
Okay, good. As long as your short-term memory isn't too bad. Yeah. Anyway, so... Yeah, what were we talking about? No, just kidding. Frequency of use is an interesting one because, as you know, Joe, from your personal explorations and from all the fantastic journalistic work that you've done for your book, that there are lots of people that know how to use this plant fairly skillfully on a daily basis, somehow to put themselves into a zone, right? I think Michael Backus was one of those people that made reference to, yeah. But there are a couple of things about that. It's a theme that comes up from several of the contributors to the book as well. One of them is Mariano da Silva. So there's a couple of things. One is, of course, the tendency for tolerance effect, which you
build a tolerance if you use a lot. You just build a tolerance, so you never get that high.
Yeah, that's right.
You never get that enhanced.
Yeah, Chris Bennett, who wrote a chapter, he's a great historian of cannabis. He's one of those people. Cannabis seems to work really well for him in a daily way. He says he said I cannot smoke sativas. He said they don't do anything for me. He says has to be an indica, right? So I'm interested in the deeper places, so to speak. I don't use cannabis daily. I tried that in my 20s, didn't work too well. Of course, I had no idea about set and setting back then, and probably could do it differently now, and maybe it would work for me in that way. However, I prefer to leave some time in between, even if it's only 3 or 4 days. My typical pattern, that's just me, I'm not trying to sell it to anybody, but, is maybe twice a week. And typically, at least one of those 2 times, I'm just going to be sitting alone. I'm going to be treating it as a meditation session, essentially, and sitting in silence, allowing thoughts to come up, jotting things down maybe, or not, just going, oh, that's a beauty, let her go, and come back to sitting and being silent with my breath and that sort of thing. I'll do a few other things and so on with that. But more specifically on this notion of frequency, it's again this tolerance effect thing. I think Mariano da Silva in the book, who's an ayahuasca shaman, but also a master with cannabis as a spiritual medicine, says that it introduces, or it opens one up to he said it opens me up to transcendental realms, and goes on about that a little bit. He said, but if I use it every day, none of that happens. Right.
Yeah.
So that's one way of looking at it. And I don't judge the people, the Chris Bennett's and the Michael Backuses of the world, who know what they're doing, and that's the other issue there, of course, because it's so easy to fall into a dependency cycle with it, right?
Let's talk about some guidelines for how one might use it creatively. Let's come back to that topic a little bit. Where can we get to with it? A lot of people do use it for creativity. A lot of people I know who work all across industries, in the finance industry and technology and coders, say that it really, really helps them to open new pathways in the mind, if you will. And I know for myself, when I'm in a phase of idea generation, it really is very useful to do that. It doesn't create great sentences. It doesn't form great tracks of linear thinking. But for Carl Sagan, it certainly brought him to some very incredibly creative places. So,
absolutely,
what do we know? What have you learned from writing about in your book about how people might be taught or directed to use it in a more generative way?
Well, there's certainly these multiple uses that you're talking about, and creativity is an expansive word. What is creativity? It's a very open-ended kind of thing. It stimulates ideas, fresh thinking, lateral thinking, all that kind of stuff. It brings in surprise ideas and so on and so on. And yeah, that's a fantastic use of cannabis, and I'm all for that. I use it for those kind of purposes myself. I'm also a musician. Well, that's hardly deserve the term musician on one level. I sort of clung desperately to the bottom rungs of the ladder professionalism about 20 years ago for a little while. And I've made 3 CDs of sort of instrumental, more or less meditative music. And when I was doing that, I haven't done that for about 10 years, but when I was doing that, my typical pattern was that I would work on a song for several days, and then I would sit back and have a puff and listen to it. And as you know, Joe, you hear things that you hadn't heard before. I'm going, wait a minute, I made that and I hadn't heard it before, right?
I know, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it brings in also these other sort of almost intangible qualities of appreciation and heart in that regard as well, that sort of connect you in more, right? I just read something that resonated really well with me because it's something that I agree with completely from my own experience in your book about how some guy was, in fact, I'm still on that page 228. Some guy gave this is a wonderful analogy or way of looking at it. He says, say you have 1,000 units of brain processing power per second. Normally you use 200 units to 5 different things, thereby handling 5 things simultaneously. but on a more superficial level. Pot can let you focus 950 units onto whatever you're doing or thinking. So, I use the term non-specific amplifier a lot. And
I like it. I like it. It's good. Yeah. Tells you a lot about how it works. Yeah.
So it's so much about intention and about how you actually channel the energy, how you channel the focus, right? So it allows you to go deep. And yes, as you well know, there's some potential costs to that. One of the people I referenced in the short chapter that I wrote on cannabis and creativity in my book is a guy who claims to have done composed a lot of symphonies for major orchestras in the United States, and uses a pseudonym, Herb Garden, he goes by. Anyway, he said, I don't have it right in front of me, but he said things that go well with cannabis and things that don't. And one of them was improvisations of 2 minutes or less. And I think that plays into the idea that you can go more deeply into the now, but you may lose perspective in the linear sense that way, right? What I've noticed when I used to do the music, the way I was talking about, was I would record several tracks of things to kind of build up a groundwork or whatever, and then I'd find an instrument that I could do more lead-like things on. This is all keyboard based anyway, and then sometimes I'd do that with cannabis, and I found I often had great ideas. But there's a thing about a solo, I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, but I think a lot of musicians would, is if you're doing like say a 2-minute guitar solo or improvised solo or something like that, it's actually a story, potentially. It has a kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end. You might start off a little slow, kind of build it up, and then find a way to resolve it, right?
Yeah.
Before it comes back.
It's sex is what it is.
So, sorry, I didn't catch that.
It's like sex. For me, I'm also a musician, and when you're talking about solos, I always equate solos to sex. You can't dive right into the craziness right off the bat. You have to work your way in. You have to warm it up. It has to have a climax, and then you can't just like bail at the end. You got to cuddle a little bit.
Is this sex with yourself you're talking
Right.
about? It's a solo, Matthew. It's a solo here.
But it's for the people, Joe.
Yeah,
it's sex with the people.
Understand. But that's a good point.
So,
let's actually, please continue, Stephen.
Well, can I say one more thing about that? So what I was going to say about that actually is that when I'm high and I'm doing a solo, if I connect in, and sometimes I like to say with cannabis and a creative endeavor or getting into something is it's like it's kind of you're on the bus or off the bus scenario, because my mechanical skills can be mitigated under the influence. But if I kind of catch the train, if I kind of catch fire, then that sort of dissipates and I can go deeper into it. However, with these longer solos I was mentioning, what I found was that I didn't have the linear perspective. So I could come up with some great ideas, but when I listened back to it the next day, I go, it doesn't really have the trajectory that it needed.
Yeah, you've always got to listen to it in the cold light of morning, I think. I think
Allen Ginsberg said, if you write stoned, edit sober.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that was something
Without
I was
a
going
doubt.
to bring up. I turn the phrase often with cannabis of silencing the editor. So we all have that editor that lives in our brain who's like, when you talk about writing, Joe,
anything,
you write that sentence, you immediately begin to think, oh, I got to change this word, I got to fix that word. And a lot of the times people who are using cannabis for creativity, it silences that editor.
Yeah.
That editor exists for a reason.
It does. Yeah, we got to let that editor back in the room. Absolutely. Yeah. Let's move to.
I just wanted to, maybe I could say something a little bit more about using cannabis in creative work, because I think I'm kind of like you. I don't like when I'm writing, I don't like to write high for any length of time for similar kind of reasons. But I do know people such as, do you know who Martin A. Lee? You probably do know who Martin A. Lee is, right?
Sure,
Smoke
of course.
Signals.
Yeah, Smoke Signals.
Martin. I hope you don't mind me saying so. Martin has told me that he writes high. And I asked him why, and he said, well, it's a vasodilator. I feel more intelligent when I'm writing. But I think this has much to do with the fact that, first of all, if he's writing, I assume he's writing daily. So there's a tolerance effect. He's not getting blasted. Probably the Neil Young, principle involved there. Mm-hmm. And also he's channeling it. So he's a skillful user of it that way.
So yes, but I want to talk about one of the topics on my mind, being a man of a certain age, is how we can use cannabis to enhance our vulnerability, to enhance our sensuality, and actually to enhance our sex lives. Because I have actually found it really useful in this regard, and I'd love to hear your take or your experience or those of others you know.
Well, I might have to disappoint you on that because I don't know that I have any insights that you haven't already found yourself, Joe. I would kind of fall back on this notion of cannabis as you've used this phrase as well, sensory enhancer, as I often say, the non-specific amplifier. And so, in the book, Cannabis and Spirituality book, there's a chapter by Joan Bellow, and I like the way that she talks about the pharmacokinetic action of the plant. The way Joan describes it is that this is when you smoke or vaporize as opposed to when you take it orally, because of course that can take up to a couple of hours to come on. But if you smoke or vaporize, pretty much immediately there's an increase in heart rate, which is pumping blood more strongly, more rich, freshly oxygenated blood throughout the organism. So sending, this fresh, increased energy throughout the organism that way. So all that's the sensory enhancement kind of explanation for it in a sense, right? Yeah. I think then the question is, again, how do you channel it? What do you do with it? And if you are relaxed, open, there are many more or less non-cerebral, I would say leaning toward the non-cerebral kind of activities. My focus in the book is more toward what, spiritual practices, and so on and so on. But I don't think there's any reason to take lovemaking out of that equation. And so why not? If it can make you more sensitive, it can open your heart a little bit more, calm you down a little bit more, just make things more expansive, and to feel, physically, physiologically feel things in your extremities more, then it's got to be beneficial, right?
One of my favorite essays in your compilation is by a woman named Kathleen Harrison, who worked with Terence McKenna, or still does, perhaps.
She was married with him for 15 years.
She writes a lot about the coevolution of humans and cannabis. Can we talk about this for a second? Because I found, it's not easy to synthesize what she's talking about quickly. Maybe you can do it better than I can. But I also found it very sort of eye-opening what she is talking about.
Well, one thing that comes to mind off the top of my head is a lovely term, which I think I kind of co-opted and changed slightly from Jeremy Wolfe, who wrote a wonderful philosophic chapter later on in the Cannabis and Spirituality book called Thoughts on Pot, Part 2. And I don't think it's actually in there. I think it's in a previous essay that he wrote, which is how I found out about him, and actually how I got connected to Julie Holland as well, was because in her book, The Pot Book, he has an essay called Thoughts on Pot, which I loved and wrote him. Anyway, he uses the term, he refers to cannabis as the people's psychedelic, which is a lovely term in my mind, and I've been using the term the people's plant. And so first of all, as far as researchers know, there's guesstimation involved. The Cannabaceae, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, lineage from which cannabis comes is estimated to be between 30 and 90 million years old. So she's an old one. And it stands to reason that it's been around wherever humans have beings, pretty much since human beings have been human beings, Homo sapiens. And it also more than stands to reason, it seems beyond obvious that when you didn't have Safeway to go to, you'd look at a plant in your neighborhood and you'd go, what does that plant do? You weren't going to miss anything. And you'd find out, this plant is good for medicine, it's good for clothing, it's good for oil, it's good for rope, it's good for netting, it's good for whatever. And then, you go, well, we've got a little extra here. Let's toss it on the fire and sing songs around the fire. And then the next thing you go, wait a minute, this thing has a psychoactive effect as well. So I think this plant has had a very, very intimate relationship with Homo sapiens as long as we could possibly know. There's a, even reference in the historical record, 10 or 11,000 years back, and that's just what we can get our hands on. So it seems obvious that way. As far as the actual co-evolution, I don't know what to say about that, Joe. I really don't know what that would be, but it's a lovely concept,
Well, it just seems that it is a plant that people have found useful all the way through history. And, until I started looking at the history of it and the thinking about really, okay, what is the relationship to a human being and a plant? It's like, oh, wow, it actually has all these essential oils so it could keep the kids alive. Or maybe when they did throw it on the fires, that was a way of getting tribes to sort of come to peace together so they didn't maul each other to death. And certainly as a healer, those guys needed some things in their tool chest that worked, or else they wouldn't have a job and there wouldn't be a tribe. So it was a useful plant in that way too. So I do think there's a long history that's not often thought about.
No, absolutely. And I think that's actually a really important part of it, and why I wanted to, in the book, address, or I wanted to include Chris Bennett's chapter on some of the history that's not meant to be exhaustive by any means, his chapter, but pointing out that it's been used in spiritual contexts for a very long time, and many, many more uses that we probably don't know about, and it's and everywhere essentially. That's the other thing about it.
Everywhere,
everywhere. They believe it started. I think what I've heard is that its first human use is somewhere in perhaps northeastern China or somewhere in Asia.
Kazakhstan, homeland of Borat.
Oh, okay, yeah. But as there were trade routes going all over the place in those, throughout, the millennia, and people would take stuff with them, and so it moved around. It got all through all parts of Asia, the Middle East. I believe one of the oldest so-called spiritual findings, I don't know if there's a better word for that, but they found some cannabis paraphernalia in the gravesite of a shaman in the Ukraine that's several thousand years old, right?
Yeah.
And then I've heard various reports about how and when primarily it moved into Africa. It's speculated that perhaps around the beginning of the Christian era, it started to filter down, but certainly at a certain point, it was everywhere in Africa, and then, as far as we know, at least 500 years in the Americas as well. So the point again being that it's the people's plant. It always has been. It always will be. Nobody ever has the right to tell us not to use this plant. It is remarkably interconnected with the human organism and the human mind.
Stephen, thank you so much for your time here. Really appreciate it. One last question, which is if there were three things that you would take away from your book, what were the three greatest things that you learned spending 5 years editing and compiling this book? Mm-hmm. Give me three.
Well, in the course of our conversation, the one area that we didn't really address directly is in the title of the book, Cannabis and Spirituality. I don't mean to place any reducing valves on that term, spirituality. However, that's almost kind of, in some ways, like the elephant in the room for a lot of people. What actually is spiritual awakening, right? So, one way to talk about or to describe that, in sort of, more or less Buddhist way of talking about it, is that there is such a thing as unconditioned reality that has nothing to do with our beliefs about what's true and not true and real and not real and all that. Nothing to do with the stories that we ship on throughout our lives and build up into what Jungian psychologist James Hollis called the false or provisional personality. In fact, all of that stuff, the narrative of the stories that we tell ourselves that put this package together, are all what's in the way of sort of letting all this stuff melt away, so to speak, and dissolve, and to land on what my old Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa called what is. Again, this is this notion of unconditioned or unconditional reality. So what if you're, and that's, in Buddhist terms, again, that's innate to every human being. That's our natural state. It's not like we have to climb up the mountain. It's like we have to just relax more and more, allow ourselves to see what we need to see if we need to look at the obstacles, but ultimately keep letting go, keep dissolving, and keep letting go of the small s self to allow that unconditioned reality to manifest. And where cannabis comes into that, as far as I'm concerned, is, again, this non-specific amplifier or channeling potential, that if you can quiet your mind, I think the purest practice, in a sense, the universal practice for human beings altogether is what you might call bare attention meditation. Just being present, right? Being fully here.
Yes.
Yeah. And so cannabis, so that's natural, that's the way it is already. And then what cannabis can do is it can, again, deepen that if you're able to channel that energy. And I just want to say, as to sum that up, that's both in the moment or in the experience when you're having the session with it, but it's also, and Joan Bello talks about this in the book, it's almost on some level that the high is a bit of a side effect, because you can get fascinated by all that stuff. But really, it's about a long-term shift from putting all your eggs in the basket of ego's narrative about who it is and who we are and what's real, blah, 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 and gradually learning to trust the unconditional intelligence of this moment right now. And so if you can channel that cannabis energy into somehow relaxing into that present space, that now space, then you're both having the experience, which can be beautiful and remarkable, et cetera, but you're also retraining yourself over time.
I'm ready to go into that now space right now. Thank you for that description. Thank you for your time. We'll come back and talk more in the future. I'd love to.
Hey, anytime. Sure. Happy to.
I really enjoyed that interview with Stephen. We've been on the science tip and talking about laws and everything like that for quite a while lately. It's nice to get somebody on the show who is involved in a more heady sort of spiritual space and attunement and atonement and those sorts of things. That was really great.
That was great, and I think there's a lot more to talk about, by the way, in that topic, and I want to talk more about it. I'm always a little wary of quote unquote spirituality because it sounds a little hokey, but I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of consciousness and awakening and our relationship to plants, because more and more people we know are using plant substances to explore different realms.
Absolutely.
And they're using them in new and really interesting ways.
Well, and it's weird because some of these things are even becoming kitsch in a way, or commonplace. Like you hear about Upper West Side socialites who are going to Jersey to take ayahuasca, rituals and things like that. It's the plant. The sort of things that would be taboo or be considered taboo are making their way into the mainstream. And I think that, the legalization movement of cannabis is clearly leading the charge in that.
Yeah. So speaking of legalization of cannabis, I just want to end this episode with a quick remembrance of a guy named Dennis Perrone, who was not a famous person at all, but in terms of cannabis was major because he, almost single-handedly, I would say, managed to get the first medical marijuana bill through the California state legislature and got it voted in by the voters in the year 1996 and started Proposition 215, which was the very first time the words medical marijuana came into consciousness and really started the entire movement of legalization. Yeah. And I met Dennis about, 5 years ago when I was reporting the book in San Francisco. I found him in this old Victorian ramshackle pile of a house. He wasn't the wellest person at the time. He had just had an operation. He had been quite sick. And he was quite quietly spoken. And he was a famous rabble-rouser. I mean, Dennis was sort of famous for making everybody, even his allies, into an enemy, which I sometimes think when you're going to change the world, you need to be that kind of personality. He was a fly in the ointment. But I remember asking him about cannabis and medical marijuana, and he gave me a great quote, and I'd like to just conclude the show with that quote. He said to me, look, I don't really find any non-medical reasons that people use marijuana. If you say you do it to get high, to me that says, well, you're just relieving a condition that's the result of some anxiety. It's like people don't drink a martini without a reason. They don't drink it because they're thirsty. And I think it's important to acknowledge that point is that all of these substances we use for a reason. And it would really help us all, I think, to examine why we're using it. Is it for anxiety? Is it for another condition? And if it is, to understand our own relationship to that anxiety. So Dennis Perrone passed away last week, and he's not going to have a heralded passing, but he did a tremendous amount for people who care about cannabis.
Hats off to you, sir.
Happy passing, Dennis. Oh, he did say one final thing. Somebody said this about it.
Yeah, I think it was.
Which is that
it was on the
Dennis,
number one comment.
Was
on
it on Reddit? It said Dennis didn't want to be cremated. He wanted to go out baked. I think that says it all. Good night, Matthew.
Good night, Joe. Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.